Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, the protest to occupy containers in Alexandra, which resulted in the death of an EFF councillor, Moshe Mphahlele, has illuminated the Joburg staggering housing backlog. Data indicates that the city faces a backlog of roughly 400,000 homes, with a current rate of delivering sitting at approximately 3,500 housing units per year. Joining us to discuss the housing Joburg crisis is Wits School of Architecture and Planning, Professor Hoot-Tsa-Maya. Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, many researchers, Professor, have said Alexandra is a microcosm of the Johannesburg housing crisis and attributing it to corruption, inequality, mismanagement, and most importantly, the rapid growth of informal settlements. Your views on just the current standoff between the Alexandra residents demanding to occupy those containers and the police?
Yes, I'd like to add one other element to that microcosm that you mentioned, and that is the spatial inequality that Alexandra represents. You know, it is just one place. It's one place in which people with very low incomes are able to live in a vast expanse of suburbia. It's people, you know, yes, there are a lot of people that do not have jobs, or that have piece jobs on some days, only in a month. But there's also a lot of people living there that are security guards and domestic workers and so on, in that vast suburban and otherwise economically endowed part of Johannesburg. And this is really the only place people can live. And I think, so there is a spatial dimension to this pent-up housing demand.
So meaning it's no surprise what we continually see there.
In a way, I wouldn't condone necessarily the occupation of those units, but certainly it is a sign of the real demand that exists there. I think there's various signs. For instance, the pace at which little brick structures are being built in that area is a sign that people have given up. People have more or less given up waiting for housing. And I think that is the occupation of this of the container TRAs, which have been standing vacant now for 3 years or more, is also a sign that people are no longer willing to wait. I was speaking to someone living in the informal settlement Twetla, who was saying that in their understanding, it is since Nelson Mandela's death that no more houses have been built in that area by the state, and that they've given up, and that's really the cause of people now not even building a shack first and transforming it later into a brick structure, but actually building a brick structure, because that it seems like it's not as if living in a shack is a waiting for a state house, and they've given up on that hope.
But why is it taking government so long to actually deliver these houses? Because just that data alone of 400,000, but we're seeing a delivery of 3,500 per year.
Yes, I think they're very, very complex issues that have to do with a number of things that the pipeline, getting projects into the pipeline, acquiring the land first on which housing can be built, and the municipality does try and get better located land, not land that is way far out. But in Alex, much of the land is developed. I mean, the Far East Bank, if you look at that part of Alex, is very densely developed already, and people are densifying it further by building double-story units, rental stock going up, right up against where the Marlborough station is even. And it's extremely densely developed already, and I do understand that the state has difficulties in finding land which it can develop in this area.
But they're always accused by opposition parties. Pardon me for interjecting there, but they're always accused by opposition parties that they need to do a comprehensive land audit, and they'd actually find out that probably they have a lot of land where they can actually start building for people.
Yeah, that, and they need to start using the instruments that are in their hands, including expropriation, to get their hands onto well-located land in that area that is underutilized, and there is such land, but it's in private hands.
To what extent has corruption and mismanagement played a role or impacted or contributed to this crisis?
It's very difficult for an academic to say that. It's not an area that we can easily research because we are tied to all sorts of ethics requirements. But our engagements with officials and so on is suggesting that there are officials with real integrity, that they're really struggling in the system because there are networks of corruption and tendencies to just escalate or inflate costs and so on, that somehow they're not able to get control over.
Yes. And then the rapid growth, Professor?
And the rapid demand.
Yes, and growth, yes, of informal settlements.
Yes, I think that has to do with that it's a sign of the demand and the fact that where there's a foothold, where an informal settlement manages to establish itself, that area often attracts more people, understandably so, and it's I think it's no surprise that informal settlements are growing in this particular area. And I wanted to contrast this with the land that obviously was acquired for these container TRAs.
Yes.
And the way they've been developed, there is quite a lot of vacant land within those developments. The container housing, I think, was perhaps quite an innovative idea initially, but during COVID-19, during the pandemic, the cost of containers got very expensive because they were not being shipped in. And we did speak to the developer at the beginning of 2022, and the contractor that was building them. And they were at the time saying that the units were very expensive individually, way more expensive than TRA units, temporary location area units. And they didn't think that they would be ever allocated to people from the informal settlement Twetla, for which those were originally built. And so, and the standards were quite high as well inside, I must say. So very, very out of sync with other temporary location areas. And so I think there must have been. We don't have insight into what decisions were made and how those TRAs even came about. But a lot of money was spent on them, and then I suppose it was a dilemma as to who they would be allocated to, and they have just stood vacant.
Which is something that the residents are saying now cannot be acceptable. They will just occupy those containers because for now they haven't been provided with any form of housing. But just in closing, there seems to constantly be this trend that whenever there's temporary housing, come the time to have those residents vacate, it becomes very difficult unless you provide alternative accommodation.
Yes, and I need to acknowledge my PhD student, Tatenda Sonono, is doing his thesis on the TRAs around that area, and most of them have become permanent to the point again that people living in them have lost hope that they'll be ever moved elsewhere and have started building in brick in some of these TRAs, building brick structures, and other people have come and grabbed land in them and built little rental units and extracting money from them. That also is a sign of this massive demand for housing, but also the collapse of management of these areas, and collapse of a pipeline. So people were moved into TRAs with the promise of actually being moved to housing, and that isn't happening. So so I'd like to say there's a massive challenge in that area.
Indeed, it's a very massive challenge. Professor, thank you very much for your time this evening. That's Professor Hoot-Tsa-Maya from Wits School of Architecture and Planning.